for it, and it's on Cuba, and my life is just going into pieces. Ay, no, ¿por qué tenemos que tener este examen de Cuba ahorita acá, pues? Nos quieren matar.
That's okay, previous Zara and Danelle, because in the next couple of minutes, we're going to teach you everything about Cuba.
Hey guys, so now we're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War, which occurred in 1898. So yeah, I think you can tell by the name that it's U.S. versus Spain. The Cubans wanted freedom from Spain, and they tried to get it starting in February as of 1895. Spain was trying to enforce them to stop and to they were trying to stop the rebellion. And of course, the news went around and it came to the U.S. And the U.S., they felt like they wanted to help the Cubans, and they wanted to get payback for the USS Maine sinking in the Havana on February 15th as of 1898. The result? Spain's colonial rule ended and the U.S. acquisition of Western Pacific and Latin American territories.
The Platt Amendment of 1901. This was basically when the U.S. Saw what was happening to Spain, and they saw Spain was very unstable, and then they thought that the same thing was going to happen to Cuba. So then they enforced something known as the Platt Amendment. So this amendment basically prohibits Cuba from going into any type of foreign trade with other countries, and also it subjects them to joining into any type of national treaty. Also, it allows the U.S. to intervene into any types of problems that Cuba might have. So this includes anything that's political, economic, or trade-wise or anything like that. The U.S. could just swoop in at any time and just take over, basically. And a lot of Cubans weren't too fond of the idea. They thought, oh, okay, the Americans could just come in as easily as they want, and then they could take over everything. So in order to create a sense of agreement, the U.S. Agreed to increase the commercial use and the trade with Cuba in exchange for the Cubans adding the Platt Amendment and abiding to it in their constitution.
And now to talk about protectorates. Okay, I'm going to define it now as the dictionary states it to be the relation of a strong state toward a weaker state or territory that it protects. So Cuba wasn't necessarily a strong country on its own, and it really needed help from other countries, as you can see beforehand with Spain and the U.S. afterwards. Because of the Platt Amendment, Cuba was now a protectorate of the U.S., and the U.S. could step in whenever Cuba needs help, which shows that it's kind of a form of imperialism, but not necessarily exactly imperialism.
So sugar was brought in by Cristobal Colon, and it was first brought by him on his second voyage to the New World, and he brought the sugarcane back to Havana, which I believe is the capital of Cuba. The sugar quickly due to the consumption from its island people, and also it was very fertile in the areas that it was being produced. Soon it caught the attention of a lot of private business owners, and the industry began to grow. And it increased so much that Cuba was providing almost a third of the world's sugarcane production. And it eventually came under the U.S.'s control in the mid-19th century.
All right, so now we have Fulgencio Batista, who was the president of Cuba in 1940 to 1944, and then he came back as a dictator in 1952 through 1959, afterwards when he was overthrown by Fidel Castro. And so he, before he was even a president, he was ruling behind the scenes, or rather through associates. And he was regarded as Cuba's most powerful man and de facto leader. And he ruled through patronage and didn't believe in terrorism, which he's kind of a hypocrite if you think about it afterwards. When he rules as a dictator, he jails his opponents, he uses terroristic methods, and he makes fortunes for himself and his associates, which shows he's not really good of a leader afterwards with Cuba.
Now we can go on to Fidel Castro. Born in 1926, Fidel Castro soon became a part of an anti-communist group in which he grew a sense of social justice and the need to correct it. During the reign of the previous dictator, by the last name of Batista, Fidel Castro had lost his political standpoint in terms of the Cuban government. So due to the fact that he was angered by this, he believed that the only just way to prove the injustice that has been happening in Cuba is by getting rid of Fulgencio Batista. So In order to do this, in 1958, he teamed up with a bunch of people and then used guerrilla warfare to overthrow his leadership. And then soon, in 1959, Castro became sworn in as the prime minister. Under his reign, he changed a lot for Cuba. For one thing, he did affect the U.S. partnership that was between the two, and he increased military reforms. And he soon took control over all of the private investments and things like that. And he basically kind of tried to push the U.S. out of the Cuban system. And in total, despite the fact that he never admitted that he was communist, he did make ties with the Soviet Union and did help them with their wars, and did also help a lot of other countries in terms of their wars and their military uses. And despite the fact that he did say he was anti-communist, over his reign, it kind of appeared as if he was communist, but he just never admitted it.
Okay, so now it's the time for Che Guevara. I probably messed that name up. So he was an Argentine Marxist, physician, author, diplomat, military theorist, and guerrilla leader. Whoa, that was a lot of things he did. So he studied medicine at the University of Buenos Aires, and he traveled around South America in 1951. That's when he saw like the conditions and everything, and he felt really bad, and he was really affected by what he saw when he saw the needy, and he wants to help them out, and he starts becoming convinced that the revolution would help the needy instead of medicine, and he altogether just abandons medicine, especially after visiting Guatemala in 1953, where the leftist government was overthrown. And if you look at history, you can also see that he joins forces with Fidel Castro to overthrow the Batista regime. In the early 1960s, he was Cuba's ambassador, and he went around the world traveling to make good amendments and try to establish relationships with different people in different countries. And then in 1965, he left Cuba when its economy was failing, and he wanted to spread his revolutionary ideas around the world.
Pigs invasion. Ooh, what a lovely name. All of the stuff that happened in terms of the Bay of Pigs occurred in 1961. It was this very same year that America had cut off its ties with Cuba, and Cuba became socialist under the reign of Fidel Castro. In April 1961, a lot of Cuban exiles, which were later on proven to be actually trained by the U.S. Marshals, had gone into the Bay of Pigs in Cuba and attempted to overthrow Castro. However, they were not successful in this, and then all of the exiles were killed or captured, and Castro actually used this as a mechanism to further prove what a good leader he was and increase his political position in the eyes of the Cubans.
Now, we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ooh. This one was a moment where there was a huge tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we were close to having a nuclear war, actually. This all occurred when the U.S.-American U-2 flew over Cuba and discovered a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile that was going to be installed in Cuba on October 14, 1962, and they took a picture of it as evidence. They felt threatened with the presence of these missiles in Cuba because they could get close to Florida and they could probably invade the country. But of course, the Soviet Union wanted to get fair with the U.S. because they also noticed that they have some missiles in their own territory, which is around also in Turkey, for example, and they felt threatened, and so instead, to make it even and come to agreement, so no war happened, they wanted to remove the missiles from Cuba only if the U.S. removed their own missiles placed in Turkey, and they promised not to invade Cuba.
Now it's time for the literacy campaign. Also occurring in 1961, which was the same year as the Bay of Pigs, this was actually one of Fidel Castro's more appraised actions during his reign. This was a result of the Cuban Revolution, and Castro had actually planned for every Cuban to receive a first-year education. Now keep in mind that at the time, a lot of Cubans couldn't receive that education because of racism, class status, or just not even the incline to learn anything. So under Castro's reign, he had decided that since a lot of Cubans can't afford the level of education that most Cubans were getting at the time, he was going to provide free education for all of these people. He did this by using over 300,000 educated volunteers and helped over 700,000 Cubans get educated. This actually took away the educational barrier, in which the illiteracy rate went from 20% to 3.9% in just over 1 year.
All right, so now we're talking about the boat people, aka the refugees from Cuba and Haiti, who came during the 1980s and the 1990s. So the Cuban refugees were accepted into the U.S. according to a policy that allowed them to come in because they felt like they were under an oppression with the communist type of government with their dictatorship rule and everything. And then they had the Haitian refugees who weren't accepted. It was because they felt that they were escaping from poverty and not from government problems.
Okay, the embargo, which occurred in 1996. Before we begin, we should actually define what embargo is. According to dictionary definitions, an embargo is an official ban on trade or other commercial activity with a particular country. Now, this was applied to all of the foreign countries or the foreign trade sectors that were trading with Cuba. And this happened in retaliation to Cuba shooting down 2 U.S. civilian airplanes. So basically, the U.S. came in and said to all the other countries that you need to limit the amount that you're trading with Cuba because Cuba went and they shot down some of our planes. So we got to show that we're boss.
Question time! Okay, so here's the first question. Why did Castro seek aid from the Soviets? Ooh, important question. He thought that the Soviets would provide beneficial aid, and he feared that the United States would invade them once more, like they did in the Bay of the Pigs invasion, as talked before by Zara. And so they would rather have the Soviets help Cuba than see Cuba really fall with its economy.
All right, so you ask, what measures did the U.S. take to undermine Castro? Well, the U.S. attempted to undermine Castro by conducting secretive acts to take him down. As we mentioned before, the Bay of Pigs happened, and it was later found out that the exiles that were trained for the Bay of Pigs were actually trained by U.S. officials, in which they were planning to use those exiles to take over Castro. Also, another thing that was executed by the U.S. included the Operation Mongoose, which was also used as an attempt to take Castro's life, so not just overthrowing him, but also killing him. And they did everything from battle attacks to exploding seashells to shoes dusted with chemicals to make his beard fall out. They almost did everything to take Castro down.
Question 3. Why did Cuba become such a hot spot during the Cold War? All right, so if you think about it, you can see that Cuba's location is pretty important since it's close to the U.S. And knowing how the Soviet and the U.S., they wanted to have neither opponent have advantage over the other, they just wanted to, take over some part of it. Like, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they wanted to put those missiles in there just to, it's kind of like a threat for him. And then there's the rise of communism with Fidel Castro. Well, he doesn't call it that, but let's face it, it's communism. And also because it was a weak country, as we talked about, and how it was a protectorate of the U.S. afterwards.
Okay, so has Castro been a success or failure as the leader of Cuba, you might be asking? Well, for the time he was in power, in the eyes of him, he could have been considered a successful leader. For the most part of his life, every single attempt the Americans had taken to either overthrow his power or destroy him, most of the time failed. And not only this, but Castro was able to use that to kind of increase his credibility. In the eyes of Castro, he did manage to achieve a lot of the stuff that he wanted to do for Cuba. He made them socialist. He did add education to them, and he also established ties with a lot of international trading units and military armies. And basically, by creating these ties, he was able to make Cuba look more credible, and just by being able to provide military equipment and warfare. So in his eyes, he was considered successful to his people. Now, the way that you might think of it as an outsider looking into Cuba, you may think differently about it. Maybe you think that socialism just isn't good for Cuba, but in the eyes of him, he was successful.